Paul gets to Rome, we're only told that he spends 2 years under house arrest there. And that's pretty much it. That's where the book of Acts ends. We don't get any details after that. We don't really know why Luke doesn't continue to count and tell us what happens after. If you buy an early date to the writing of the Gospel of Luke and the book of Acts, then you would see that you would believe that the author was Luke, the companion of Paul, and so maybe he was writing these works as some kind of court documents in Paul's appeal to Caesar, some way of providing the court some information about who Paul was, what motivated him, and why he was there before the court. If this is the case, then it's obvious why he ends here. He just ends at the modern time. They haven't had the trial yet. And his works would have been finished shortly before the trial was held. And so it would have been about 2 years into when Paul was under house arrest that he would have completed it and then given it to the courts. But if Luke and Acts were written later, then it's possible the author of these books saw the work of the gospel as being completed. Paul's goal of getting to Rome and preaching the gospel in the highest court of the land has been completed. He's done. There's no need to tell of anything after that. So what did happen after this? What happened to Paul? Well, tradition gives us a few different options. Probably the most popular tradition is that Paul was in Rome during the fires in 64 AD that Nero uses to blame Christians and persecute Christians, and many Christians were put to death, being held accountable and at fault for the fires that burned a lot of Rome. If that's the case, then Paul, as a citizen of Rome, wouldn't have been murdered with the rest of the Christians, which he would have been treated very poorly, but Paul would have been given a quick death and beheaded. There's actually a site outside of the old walls of Rome where there's a church built, which is supposedly the burial site of Paul after he was beheaded in 64 AD. But if we were to buy some other accounts, for example, Clement, one of the early bishops of Rome, in fact, he lived in the late 1st century, early 2nd century, so this is a guy who would have been just a generation or so off from Paul's death, says that Paul went further to the west and preached the Gospels to the ends of the earth, which would have meant that Paul, with some earlier traditions, maybe did another mission journey off to Spain, which is very potentially likely even if he died in 64 AD in Rome, because it could have been that he got his appeal in 62, and then he got off, Caesar let him off, and he was released, and he decided, let's go west. We're close enough to Spain. Let's go to Spain and follow trade routes to the west. And then on his return, coming back through Rome, could have been when he was in the fire 2 years later and then beheaded. But Clement doesn't say that. Clement says that he lives a lot longer, he does more mission work, that he becomes kind of a inspiration to the idea of perseverance in faith. And then he is taken up to be with the Lord, that he dies, that he no longer is with us. So if that's the case, then Paul lived a probably longer life and did many more things after this. We have really no way of knowing. There's different accounts and different traditions. But whatever it is that happens to Paul after this date, there's some things that we can really look at Paul's life and learn from. Number one, I think, is zeal. We saw this as a theme throughout all of our videos, is that Paul was very zealous for the Lord, both when he was a Jewish believer who's persecuting Christians, but also when he all of a sudden was given the epiphany, the revelation that Jesus was the Messiah Israel had been waiting for. His zeal transfers to Jesus, and his zeal becomes a willingness to serve and to suffer for Jesus the same way he was going to serve and suffer for Yahweh in his Jewish faith. And so it becomes an extension of his Jewish faith, a completion, but with a new goal, and that is for the completed role of the Messiah, Jesus Christ, as the Savior of the world and as God with us. So we, as Christians, we can be encouraged by the zeal of Paul, find in ourselves our own zeal, our own passion to follow after Christ. Second thing I think we can see is perseverance. We just said it in Clement's own letter in writing about Paul, that he became an example of perseverance and faith. Could we begin to see how sometimes we let the smallest things bug us? And here's this man who encountered great strife and persecution throughout his work for the gospel, and yet he never let it stop him. Even in times where he was darkest, where he was most down, he still chose to be faithful and follow after the calling that God has given to them. We can learn something from his perseverance. And I think the final thing that we can think about and we can learn about is how Paul's heart was to those around him. Now, Paul grew and some rough edges had to be polished. We saw that somewhat along the way. But Paul cared for those around him in the same way that he believed Jesus cared for him. And so Paul put others first and their interests ahead of his own. And he chose to think the best about people. He chose to encourage people in his writings with them. And he thought how he could be the least barrier possible in sharing the gospel with others. So he says things like, to the Jew I became a Jew, to the slave I became like a slave, to the Greek a Greek. He becomes like those he is ministering to so that he becomes the least offense possible, so that they might be able to hear the good news of Jesus, come to know the saving power of Jesus for all of humanity. Paul's life was rich with all of these things, and there's more that you could probably pick out. So think through, maybe go back and watch some of your favorite videos again, or read some of the scriptures of Paul's life again in his writings, and think through what are some things that you can challenge yourself with to learn and to grow in your faith from the example of Paul in his life. Thanks for watching these videos and going through them with us. Hopefully, we will continue on and studying something else at some point in the future.